Elena Frost looked like any other new civilian contractor on her first day at Fort Benning. But when she picked up that rifle for what everyone believed was her first time, the way her fingers instinctively found the safety, the way she balanced, the weapon's weight, the way she moved with the fluid precision of someone who'd done this thousands of times before, it sent chills down Master Sergeant Caleb Reed's spine. Because Elena wasn't supposed to know how to handle a weapon like that. And what Reed discovered about her true identity would shake the entire base to its core. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Fort Benning training grounds as Elena Frost pulled her beat-up Honda Civic into the contractor parking area. At 32, she had the kind of unremarkable appearance that made her blend into any crowd. Medium height, shoulder-length auburn hair usually pulled back in a simple ponytail, and wire-rimmed glasses that gave her the look of someone more comfortable behind a desk than on a military installation. She wore standard contractor attire, khaki cargo pants, a plain blue polo shirt with facility maintenance services embroidered on the chest, and steel-toed work boots that looked fresh. Out of the box, Elena had been hired 3 days earlier to replace the previous maintenance contractor who'd quit without notice. Her resume was straightforward: 2 years of general maintenance work at a community college in Georgia, basic electrical certification, and clean background check. Nothing remarkable. Nothing that would draw attention. Exactly the kind of quiet competence that military facilities needed for their behind-the-scenes operations. She gathered her new employee packet from the passenger seat, taking a moment to review the base map and her assignment details. Elena would be responsible for maintaining the weapons training facilities, cleaning, minor repairs, equipment organization, and general upkeep of the ranges where soldiers learned the fundamentals of marksmanship. It was mundane work that most people would find tedious, but Elena had specifically requested assignment to the firearms training areas when given the choice between different maintenance sectors. "First day nerves," she murmured to herself, though her voice carried none of the anxiety that phrase usually implied. Instead, there was something almost anticipatory in her tone, like someone who'd been waiting for this opportunity for a very long time. The security checkpoint at the main gate was routine. Elena presented her new contractor ID, submitted to a basic search of her small tool bag, and received a temporary base pass that would allow her access to the training areas. The young MP who processed her paperwork merely glanced at her face, stamping her documents with the kind of efficient disinterest that came from processing dozens of contractors every week. "Welcome to Fort Benning, ma'am," the MP said automatically. "Report to Building 4A for your safety briefing before beginning work." Elena nodded politely and drove deeper into the base, following signs toward the training complex. Fort Benning was massive, covering over 180,000 acres of Georgia countryside, and home to some of the Army's most intensive training programs. The Infantry School, Ranger School, and Officer Candidate School all operated here, creating a constant flow of soldiers at various stages of their military development. Building 4A housed the Civilian Contractor Orientation Office, where Elena spent the next 2 hours completing safety briefings, receiving her permanent base access credentials, and getting briefed on the specific protocols for working around live fire exercises. The briefing officer, a tired-looking staff sergeant named Dunn, explained the basic rules with the weary patience of someone who'd given the same speech hundreds of times. "Most important thing to remember," Sergeant Dunn emphasized, "is that when you hear the range go hot, you stop whatever you're doing and clear the area immediately. These aren't training weapons. They're using live ammunition, and safety protocols exist for a reason." Elena nodded attentively, asking appropriate questions about emergency procedures and equipment storage protocols. She played the part perfectly. a civilian contractor who understood she was entering a dangerous environment and wanted to follow all the rules to stay safe. After the briefing, Dunn walked Elena to Range Complex C, where she'd be working primarily. The facility consisted of multiple outdoor ranges designed for different types of training: basic marksmanship, advanced precision shooting, tactical movement exercises, and weapons familiarization for new recruits. Your predecessor left things in decent shape, Dunn explained as they walked past the shooting lanes. Main thing is keeping the ranges clean after training sessions, organizing equipment, and doing basic maintenance on the non-weapon systems targets, barriers, lighting, that sort of thing. They paused at a storage building adjacent to the main range. Dunn unlocked the door and showed Elena inside. The space was filled with maintenance equipment, cleaning supplies, and racks of training weapons that were used for safety instruction before soldiers moved on to live fire exercises. These are dummy rifles, deactivated weapons that we use for teaching basic handling, cleaning, and safety procedures, Dunn explained, gesturing toward a rack of rifles that looked identical to the real thing, but had been permanently disabled. Part of your job will be keeping them clean and organized. Recruits are hard on equipment, and these training weapons take a beating. Elena examined the training rifles with what appeared to be mild curiosity. Do I need any special training to handle these? Nah, they're completely safe. No firing pins, no way to chamber ammunition. We'll have someone show you basic cleaning procedures. It's not complicated, just time-consuming. As they continued the tour, Elena met some of the training staff who worked in the area. Staff Sergeant Craig Bishop supervised the range operations and would be her primary point of contact for maintenance issues. Sergeant First Class Ian Wells managed the weapons familiarization program for new recruits. Captain Holly Brennan oversaw the entire training complex and would review Elena's work performance after her first month, but it was Master Sergeant Caleb Reed who caught Elena's attention immediately. Reed was a Green Beret, assigned to Fort Benning temporarily while recovering from a training injury that had sidelined him from active special operations duty. He'd been given light duty supervising advanced marksmanship training, and his reputation preceded him 15 years of special forces experience, multiple combat deployments, and the kind of tactical expertise that made other soldiers stop and listen when he spoke. Reed was observing a group of officer candidate school students. When Elena was introduced to him, he turned from the firing line to shake her hand, and Elena found herself looking into the sharp, analytical eyes of someone who'd spent years identifying threats and assessing situations in hostile environments. Miss Frost, Reed said, his handshake firm but not aggressive. Welcome to the team. Sergeant Dunn says he'll be helping keep our equipment in working order. That's the plan, Elena replied, meeting his gaze steadily. I'm looking forward to learning about how everything operates here. There was something in the way Reed studied her face that suggested he was filing away details for later consideration. But after a moment, he nodded and returned his attention to the training exercise. Well, if you need anything or have questions about how we run things, don't hesitate to ask, he said. Safety is everyone's responsibility here. As Elena completed her first day orientation and prepared to begin actual work the following morning, she felt a familiar sensation, the kind of heightened awareness that came from operating in an environment where every detail mattered. She'd been preparing for this assignment for months, studying Fort Benning's layout, researching the personnel, and carefully constructing her cover identity. But standing in the weapons training facility, surrounded by soldiers who represented the best of American military training, Elena found herself thinking about why she was really here. It wasn't to maintain equipment or clean training ranges. She was here because someone at Fort Benning was responsible for something that had cost lives and compromised national security. Someone who thought they'd covered their tracks well enough that no one would ever find them. Elena Frost might look like an ordinary maintenance contractor, but she was actually something else entirely. And tomorrow, when she picked up her first training rifle to learn basic cleaning procedures, she was going to have to be very, very careful not to reveal just how much she already knew about weapons, tactics, and the kind of military operations that weren't supposed to exist. The hunt was about to begin, and Elena had waited a very long time for this opportunity. Elena's first real day of work began at 6:30 a.m., 30 minutes before the morning training session started. She'd arrived early, ostensibly to familiarize herself with the equipment and establish a routine, but really to observe the base's operational patterns without drawing attention to herself. The parking lot was already half full with soldiers preparing for their daily training, and Elena could hear the distant sounds of PT formations running cadence somewhere across the base. She unlocked the maintenance storage building and began organizing her supplies, moving with the kind of methodical efficiency that suggested she took her work seriously. Elena had spent considerable time the previous evening studying maintenance manuals and equipment specifications, not because she needed to learn the procedures, but because she needed to be able to perform them convincingly while conducting her real mission. The first soldiers to arrive were a group of infantry basic combat training recruits, led by Sergeant First Class Ian Wells. They were young, mostly 18 and 19 years old, with the kind of nervous energy that came from knowing they were about to handle real weapons for the first time in their military careers. Elena watched them from the storage building as Wells lined them up at the edge of the range and began his safety briefing. "Today we start weapons familiarization," Wells announced, his voice carrying clearly across the range. "Before any of you touches a live weapon, you're going to learn proper handling, cleaning, and safety procedures with training rifles. These procedures will keep you alive in combat, so pay attention." Elena emerged from the storage building carrying a cleaning kit and a stack of shop towels, playing the part of a contractor getting ready to support the training exercise. Several of the recruits glanced at her with mild curiosity. A civilian woman working on a military training range was still unusual enough to warrant notice, but most of their attention was focused on Wells and the rack of training rifles he was preparing to distribute. "Ma'am," one of the recruits called out as Elena passed nearby, "are you going to be cleaning weapons too?" Private Owen Fletcher was a tall, lanky kid from somewhere in the Midwest, with the kind of eager attitude that marked him as someone who genuinely wanted to excel in his military training. Elena smiled at him with appropriate civilian nervousness. "I think so," she replied, adjusting her glasses in a gesture that made her look uncertain. "This is all pretty new to me. I've never been around military weapons before." Fletcher grinned. "Don't worry, ma'am. We're all learning together. Sergeant Wells says the cleaning procedures are pretty straightforward once you get the hang of it." Elena nodded gratefully, though she could have disassembled and cleaned the training rifles in her sleep. She'd been working with similar weapons systems for over a decade, but Owen Fletcher and his fellow recruits had no way of knowing that. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Wells began distributing the training rifles, calling out safety reminders as each recruit received their weapon. "Treat every weapon as if it's loaded. Never point your muzzle at anything you don't intend to destroy. Keep your finger off the trigger until you're ready to shoot. Know your target and what's beyond it." Elena positioned herself where she could observe the training without interfering, ostensibly organizing cleaning supplies but actually studying the soldiers and their procedures. Her real mission required her to understand how information flowed through the training command, who had access to classified materials, and how security protocols were implemented at the operational level. That's when Master Sergeant Caleb Reed appeared. Reed moved with the fluid economy of motion that marked experienced special operations personnel. Even with his temporary light-duty status, He carried himself like someone accustomed to life or death decision-making. Elena noticed him immediately, though she was careful not to let her awareness show. "How's the new group looking, Wells?" Reed asked, surveying the line of recruits who were now holding their training rifles and waiting for instruction. "Typical mix," Wells replied. "Few naturals, few who'll need extra attention, most somewhere in the middle. What brings you by?" "Captain Brennan asked me to observe the weapons familiarization program. She's considering some modifications, too. The curriculum based on what we're seeing from recent graduates in advanced training." Elena continued her equipment organization, but she was listening intently to the conversation. Any changes to training curricula would involve reviewing classified tactical procedures, exactly the kind of information her real investigation was designed to uncover. Reed's attention drifted to Elena as she worked. "New contractor?" "Started yesterday," Wells confirmed. "Elena Frost seems competent enough, though she's pretty green when it comes to military operations." "Ms. Frost," Reed called out, "mind if I ask about your background? It's always helpful to know what kind of experience our support personnel bring to the job." Elena looked up from her supplies with the slightly startled expression of someone who wasn't used to being addressed by senior military personnel. "Oh, nothing too exciting, Sergeant. I did maintenance work at a community college for a couple years. Basic electrical, some HVAC, general repairs. This is definitely a step up in terms of everything." Reed nodded, but Elena caught him studying her movements as she organized her equipment. There was something in his expression that suggested he was filing away details, though she couldn't be sure what had caught his attention. "Well, welcome to Fort Benning," Reed said. "If you have any questions about how we operate here, don't hesitate to ask." "Actually," Elena said, seizing the opportunity to demonstrate appropriate civilian curiosity, "I am supposed to learn the weapon cleaning procedures. Would it be possible to observe the training? I'd like to understand what I'm supporting." Wells glanced at Reed, who shrugged. "Can't hurt. Just stay back and don't interfere with the instruction." Elena nodded gratefully and positioned herself where she could watch the training exercise. Wells began demonstrating proper rifle handling procedures, showing the recruits how to check that a weapon was unloaded, how to hold it safely, and how to begin basic field stripping for cleaning. "First step is always the same," Wells explained. "Ensure the weapon is clear. Remove the magazine, lock the bolt to the rear, visually inspect the chamber. Never assume a weapon is unloaded." Elena watched intently, though not for the reasons the soldiers assumed. She was studying their procedures not to learn them, but to understand how closely they matched the advanced tactical protocol she was investigating. Someone at Fort Benning had been leaking classified training materials to unauthorized parties, and Elena needed to identify the source. As the training session continued, Elena noticed several things that didn't appear in standard operating procedures. Wells was incorporating advanced safety checks and handling techniques that went beyond basic infantry training. The modifications were subtle, but Elena recognized them as elements from special operations curricula that weren't supposed to be part of regular recruit training. More interesting was Reed's reaction to the training. He was watching Wells with the kind of focused attention that suggested he was evaluating more than just the instructor's teaching effectiveness. Elena got the impression that Reed was assessing whether sensitive procedures were being properly protected or inadvertently disclosed. When the formal instruction ended, and the recruits began practicing the cleaning procedures under Wells's supervision, Reed approached Elena again. "What do you think?" he asked. "Overwhelming for someone new to military operations?" Elena adjusted her glasses nervously. "It's definitely more complex than I expected. There seem to be a lot of safety procedures and, I don't know, specific ways of doing things." "That's because lives depend on following those procedures correctly," Reed replied. "Everything we do here is designed to keep soldiers alive in combat situations." "I can see that," Elena said. "It's actually pretty impressive how systematic everything is." Reed nodded, but Elena noticed he was still studying her reactions carefully. She needed to be extremely cautious about how much understanding she displayed. Her cover depended on appearing genuinely inexperienced with military operations, even though she could probably teach most of these procedures herself. As the training session concluded and the recruits cleaned and returned their rifles, Elena began her actual maintenance work. But she was acutely aware that Master Sergeant Caleb Reed was watching her more closely than seemed necessary for a simple contractor orientation. Something had caught his attention, and Elena couldn't afford to let her guard down. Tomorrow, when she would handle her first training rifle for cleaning instruction, she would have to be even more careful about concealing her true capabilities. The second day started with an unexpected development that would change everything. Elena arrived at her usual time, but found the range already bustling with activity. Captain Holly Brennan was conducting an impromptu evaluation of the weapons familiarization program, and she'd brought several senior officers to observe the training procedures. "Ms. Frost," Staff Sergeant Bishop called out as Elena approached the storage building. "Change of plans today. Captain Brennan wants all support personnel to participate in the basic weapons handling demonstration. Says it's important for everyone working around firearms to understand proper procedures." Elena felt her pulse quicken, though she kept her expression neutral. This wasn't part of her planned timeline. She'd been preparing to gradually integrate herself into the weapons training over several weeks, carefully controlling when and how she demonstrated her capabilities. Being thrust into a demonstration with senior officers present created significant risk of exposure. "Participate how?" Elena asked, adjusting her glasses in what had become a signature nervous gesture. "Basic handling and cleaning procedures," Bishop explained. "Nothing complicated. Captain thinks it'll be good training for the civilian contractors and will help you understand what the soldiers are learning." Elena nodded, though her mind was racing through the implications. She'd have to handle a rifle in front of multiple experienced officers, including Master Sergeant Reed, who was already paying more attention to her than she was comfortable with. Any mistake showing too much familiarity or too little competence could compromise her mission. Captain Brennan was a sharp-eyed officer in her mid-30s with the kind of focused intensity that came from years of managing complex training operations. She'd been at Fort Benning for 3 years and had a reputation for innovative approaches to military education. Elena had studied Brennan's background extensively. She was exactly the type of officer who might notice inconsistencies in a contractor's behavior. "Good morning, everyone," Brennan announced to the assembled group of soldiers and civilian personnel. "Today we're going to demonstrate integrated training procedures. Our civilian contractors work alongside military personnel daily, and it's important that everyone understands basic safety protocols and weapons handling procedures." Elena found herself grouped with 3 other civilian contractors, 2 men from the facilities maintenance team and a woman from the administrative staff. None of them looked particularly comfortable with the prospect of handling military weapons, which provided perfect cover for Elena's own apparent nervousness. "Sergeant." First Class Wells began the demonstration with the same safety briefing he'd given the recruits the previous day. Elena listened attentively, asking appropriate questions and taking notes on a small pad she'd brought specifically for maintaining her cover. "The most important thing to remember," Wells emphasized, "is that every weapon handling procedure starts with ensuring the rifle is completely unloaded and safe. We're going to practice this several times before anyone touches a rifle." Master Sergeant Reed positioned himself where he could observe all the participants, but Elena noticed his attention seemed particularly focused on her. She couldn't tell if it was routine interest in how civilians handled weapons training or something more specific. When Wells finally began distributing the training rifles, Elena accepted hers with what appeared to be appropriate caution. Weapon was a standard M4 training rifle, identical in weight and feel to the combat versions, but permanently disabled to prevent any possibility of firing live ammunition. First step, Wells announced, is to inspect the weapon to ensure it's unloaded. This was the critical moment. Elena had performed this procedure thousands of times, but she had to make it look like she was learning it for the first time. She watched carefully as Wells demonstrated the proper technique, then attempted to replicate his movements with the kind of hesitant concentration that would be expected from a civilian, but the rifle felt different in her hands than she'd anticipated. The weight distribution was familiar. The balance points were exactly where muscle memory expected them to be. Elena realized she was going to have to fight against years of ingrained training to appear genuinely inexperienced. She fumbled slightly with the magazine release, making it look like she was struggling to remember the sequence Wells had demonstrated. Several of the officers smiled at her apparent difficulty, which was exactly the reaction she wanted. But when she moved to check the chamber, something went wrong. Elena's hands moved into the proper grip automatically, her fingers finding the optimal hold points without conscious thought. Her stance shifted into a position that provided perfect weapon control and maximum stability. For just a moment, maybe 3 seconds, Elena Frost stopped looking like a nervous civilian contractor and started looking like someone who'd been handling rifles professionally for years. Master. Sergeant Reed saw it immediately. Reed had spent 15 years in special operations, working with some of the most highly trained soldiers in the world. He knew what professional weapons handling looked like, and what he'd just witnessed was muscle memory so deeply ingrained that it had overridden conscious control. Elena realized her mistake the instant she made it. She quickly shifted back to an awkward, uncertain grip, making a show of struggling with the weapon's weight and asking Wells for clarification on the proper hand placement. But it was too late. Reed had seen enough to know that her apparent inexperience was completely fabricated. "Ms. Frost," Reed said, stepping closer. "You seem to be getting the hang of that pretty quickly." Elena looked up with what she hoped was appropriate surprise at the compliment. "Really? It feels pretty awkward to me. I'm worried I'm going to drop it or do something wrong." "No, you're doing fine," Reed replied, but his tone carried an undercurrent that suggested he was thinking about something else entirely. "Have you ever handled firearms before? Hunting, maybe? Target shooting?" The question was casual, but Elena recognized it as a probe. Reed was giving her an opportunity to provide a plausible explanation for any weapons familiarity she might accidentally display. "My dad took me shooting a few times when I was younger," Elena said, which was actually true, though it had nothing to do with her current capabilities. "But that was just a .22 rifle for target practice, nothing like this." Reed nodded, but Elena could see him filing away her response for later consideration. She needed to be much more careful about controlling her reactions to the training. As the demonstration continued, Elena forced herself to make the kinds of mistakes that would be expected from someone learning basic weapons procedures. She struggled with the field stripping sequence, asked for help reassembling the rifle, and generally played the part of a civilian who was trying hard, but clearly out of her element. But she could feel Reed's attention on her throughout the exercise. Every time she handled the rifle, every time she responded to instruction, every time she asked a question, Reed was watching and evaluating. Elena began to suspect that her cover might already be compromised, even though she'd been at Fort Benning for less than 48 hours. When the training session concluded, Captain Brennan gathered the civilian participants for a brief discussion about what they'd learned. Elena provided appropriate feedback about the value of understanding safety procedures and how the training would help her work more effectively around military operations. "Any questions before we wrap up?" Brennan asked. "Actually, yes," Elena said, seizing an opportunity to advance her investigation while maintaining her cover. "I'm curious about how often the training procedures get updated. Do you change the curriculum based on, I don't know, new developments or feedback from other bases? It was a carefully crafted question designed to probe whether Fort Benning was incorporating classified tactical innovations into their basic training, which was part of what Elena's investigation was designed to uncover. That's actually a very good question, Brennan replied. We do update our procedures regularly based on lessons learned from operational deployments and advances in tactical doctrine. It's important that our training reflects current best practices. Elena nodded thoughtfully, but she noticed that Reed was studying her reaction to Brennan's answer with increased intensity. She was walking a dangerous line between gathering necessary intelligence and arousing suspicion about her motives for asking such specific questions. As the group dispersed and Elena began cleaning up the training equipment, Reed approached her one more time. Miss Frost, could I speak with you privately for a moment? Elena's heart rate spiked, but she kept her expression neutral. Of course, Sergeant. Reed waited until they were away from the other personnel before speaking. I wanted to ask you about your experience today. How did it feel handling the rifle? Intimidating, Elena replied honestly. I can see why military training is so intensive. There's a lot more to it than I expected. Reed was quiet for a moment, and Elena got the impression he was carefully considering his next words. I've been doing this for a long time, he said finally, and I've learned to notice things that don't quite add up. I think you might have more experience with weapons than you're letting on. Elena felt the walls closing in around her cover story, but she forced herself to remain calm. Everything depended on how she handled the next few minutes. Elena took a deep breath, maintaining eye contact with Reed while internally calculating her options. She could stick rigidly to her cover story, but Reed was clearly suspicious and wouldn't be easily convinced. Or she could provide a partial truth that might satisfy his concerns without compromising her mission. You're very observant, Sergeant, Elena said finally. You're right that I wasn't completely honest about my experience. Reed's expression didn't change, but Elena could sense his increased attention. Go on. My ex-husband was military, Elena said, weaving truth into her cover story. Army National Guard. He taught me basic weapons handling because he thought I should know how to defend myself when he was deployed. But when our marriage fell apart, I tried to put all of that behind me. I guess some things stick with you whether you want them to or not. It was a plausible explanation that would account for any weapons familiarity she might accidentally display while still maintaining her civilian contractor identity. More importantly, it was emotionally resonant in a way that might discourage Reed from probing too deeply. Reed studied her for a long moment. What was his MOS? The question was a test. Military occupational specialty codes were specific, and a civilian with only basic exposure through a spouse wouldn't necessarily know the terminology or be able to provide accurate details. 11 Bravo, Elena replied without hesitation. Infantry. He did 2 deployments to Afghanistan before we divorced. She'd chosen infantry because it was common enough to be believable and would explain why her ex-husband might have taught her rifle handling without suggesting exposure to more specialized tactics. Reed nodded slowly. How long ago was the divorce? 3 years, Elena said. I've been trying to build a new life since then. Coming to work here, it brings back memories I'd rather forget. I'm sorry, Reed said, and Elena could hear genuine sympathy in his voice. That explains a lot. Military divorces are tough, especially when deployments are involved. Elena felt a mixture of relief and guilt. The sympathy in Reed's voice suggested her explanation had been effective, but she didn't like using the very real pain of military families as cover for her deception. Thank you, she said quietly. I probably should have mentioned it when I started here, but I was hoping I could just focus on the job and not think about the past. Completely understandable, Reed replied. But if working around weapons training is going to be a problem for you, we should address that now. There are other maintenance assignments available. Elena shook her head quickly. No, I think I'll be okay. Actually, today was better than I expected. It felt, I don't know, like maybe I can handle being around this stuff again. Reed seemed satisfied with her explanation, but Elena noticed he was still studying her reactions carefully. She'd bought herself some breathing room, but she hadn't eliminated his suspicions entirely. Over the following days, Elena settled into a routine that allowed her to conduct her investigation while maintaining her cover. She arrived early each morning to prepare equipment and observe the base's operational patterns. Her maintenance work gave her legitimate access to training areas, weapons storage facilities, and administrative offices were sensitive. Information might be processed. What she discovered during those first few days was troubling. Elena's real mission involved investigating reports that classified tactical procedures were being leaked from Fort Benning to unauthorized parties. Intelligence agencies had traced several security breaches to training materials that originated from the infantry school, but they hadn't been able to identify the specific source or method of the leaks. As Elena observed the daily operations, she began to notice irregularities in how classified information was being handled. Training instructors were incorporating advanced techniques into basic curricula without proper documentation or authorization. Sensitive tactical procedures that should have been restricted to special operations training were appearing in materials used for regular infantry instruction. More concerning was the apparent lack of oversight for these modifications. Elena observed several instances where instructors were teaching procedures that she recognized from classified special operations manuals, but when she checked the official training schedules and curricula, there was no record of authorization. For those additions, someone was systematically introducing classified material into the regular training pipeline, either through ignorance of security protocols or deliberate intent to compromise sensitive procedures. Elena's investigation required her to document these irregularities without arousing suspicion about her interest in training procedures. She began carrying a small notebook where she recorded maintenance observations that were actually detailed intelligence assessments of security vulnerabilities. The challenge was gathering this information while continuing to play the role of an inexperienced civilian contractor. Elena had to ask naive questions about procedures she could have taught herself, express appropriate confusion about military terminology she understood perfectly, and generally maintain the persona of someone learning about military operations. For the first time, Master Sergeant Reed continued to pay attention to her work, but his suspicions seemed to have been satisfied by her explanation about her ex-husband's military service. He occasionally asked about her comfort level with weapons training and offered advice about dealing with difficult memories, which Elena accepted gratefully while privately feeling guilty about her deception. The breakthrough in her investigation came during her second week at Fort Benning, when she observed a training session that included procedures she definitely recognized as classified. Special Operations Tactics. Sergeant First Class Wells was conducting advanced marksmanship training for a group of officer candidate school students. The session was supposed to focus on basic precision shooting, but Elena watched Wells demonstrate shooting positions and breathing techniques that she knew were restricted to Special Forces training. Even more troubling, Wells was teaching these techniques as if they were standard infantry procedures, with no acknowledgement that he was using classified material. Either he didn't realize the techniques were classified, which suggested a serious breach in security protocols, or he was deliberately introducing restricted material into the regular training curriculum. Elena began documenting Wells's training methods in detail, noting which procedures matched classified tactical manuals and how they were being integrated into regular instruction. She needed to determine whether Wells was acting alone or as part of a larger security breach that involved multiple personnel. The investigation took an unexpected turn when Elena discovered that Wells wasn't the only instructor incorporating unauthorized techniques into his training. Staff Sergeant Bishop was teaching advanced equipment handling procedures that exceeded the scope of basic infantry training. Even Captain Brennan seemed to be encouraging innovations that pushed the boundaries of approved curricula. Elena began to suspect that the security breach at Fort Benning was more extensive than intelligence agencies had realized. Instead of a single source leaking classified information, there appeared to be a systematic pattern of unauthorized disclosure that involved multiple levels of the training command. But identifying the problem was only the first step. Elena needed to determine how classified material was being accessed, who was responsible for introducing it into regular training, and whether the breaches were intentional or the result of inadequate security protocols. The answer to those questions would require Elena to take significant risks with her cover identity. She needed access to training files, instructor materials, and administrative records that would reveal how sensitive information was flowing through the training command, and that meant she would have to get much closer to the personnel she was investigating, particularly Sergeant First Class Wells, who seemed to be at the center of the unauthorized training modifications. Elena knew that getting closer to CUF Wells would require her to demonstrate more competence and familiarity with military operations than her cover story could easily support. But without that access, she couldn't complete her mission or identify the full scope of the security breach. The time for passive observation was ending. Elena was going to have to take active steps to infiltrate the training command's inner circle, and that meant taking risks that could expose her true identity and compromise everything she'd worked to achieve. Elena's opportunity to get closer to the investigation's key targets came sooner than expected, but in a way that would test her cover story to its limits. On Friday morning of her second week, Staff Sergeant Bishop approached her with an unusual request. "Miss Frost, I need to ask you a favor," Bishop said, finding Elena as she organized maintenance supplies. "We're short-staffed this weekend, and Captain Brennan has authorized overtime for contractors who want to help with a special training event." Elena looked up with appropriate interest. "What kind of training event?" "Advanced tactical exercises for special operations candidates," Bishop explained. "They'll be using some of our more sophisticated training equipment, and we need someone who understands weapon systems to help with setup and maintenance support." It was exactly the kind of access Elena needed to advance her investigation, but it also represented a significant risk. Working closely with special operations training would put her in direct contact with personnel who might recognize advanced tactical knowledge if she accidentally revealed it. "I'd be willing to help," Elena said carefully, "but I'm not sure I'm qualified for that level of equipment. My experience is pretty basic." "That's actually why I thought of you," Bishop replied. "Captain Brennan was impressed with how quickly you picked up the weapons handling procedures last week. She thinks you might have more potential than you realize." Elena felt a chill of concern. If Captain Brennan was taking special notice of her capabilities, it suggested that her performance during the rifle demonstration had been more revealing than she'd intended. She needed to be extremely careful about how much competence she displayed. "I appreciate the confidence," Elena said, "but I don't want to get in over my head. What would I actually be doing?" Bishop pulled out a clipboard with duty assignments, primarily equipment checks and maintenance support. Making sure training weapons are properly cleaned and organized, helping with range setup, basic logistics support. Nothing that requires advanced technical knowledge. Elena agreed to the overtime assignment, though privately she was planning to use the opportunity to gather intelligence about how classified tactical procedures were being integrated into special operations training. If someone at Fort Benning was systematically leaking sensitive information, the advanced training programs would be where the most valuable intelligence was being processed. The weekend training event began early Saturday morning with a briefing that Elena was allowed to attend as part of the support staff. The session was led by Major Vincent Shaw, a special operations officer who'd been brought in specifically to evaluate Fort Benning's advanced training programs. This weekend's exercises will test candidate proficiency in advanced tactical procedures. Shaw announced to the assembled group of soldiers and support personnel. We'll be using classified training scenarios and restricted tactical protocols, so everyone present needs to understand that operational security is paramount. Elena took careful notes, though she was more interested in observing who had access to the classified materials and how they were being handled. She noticed that several instructors, including Sergeant First Class Wells, were carrying training manuals that she didn't recognize from standard infantry curricula. Support personnel, Shaw continued, looking directly at Elena and the other civilian contractors, will be working with training equipment that simulates classified systems. You'll be briefed on specific handling procedures, but remember that everything you observe this weekend is considered sensitive information. After the briefing, Elena was assigned to work with a team preparing weapons and equipment for the tactical exercises. The assignment put her in direct contact with Wells, who was supervising the setup of advanced marksmanship training stations. "Miss Frost," Wells said as she approached his area, "Staff Sergeant Bishop says you're here to help with equipment preparation." "That's right," Elena replied. "Though I should probably warn you that this is definitely more advanced than anything I've worked with before." Wells gestured toward a rack of precision rifles that were set up for long-range marksmanship training. "These are specialized weapon systems used for advanced tactical training. They're more complex than the basic rifles you've been working with, but the fundamental procedures are similar." Elena examined the rifles with what appeared to be appropriate caution and curiosity. In reality, she recognized them immediately as the same type of precision weapon systems used by military special operations units. The fact that they were being used for training at Fort Benning suggested either legitimate special operations instruction or inappropriate use of classified equipment. "The main difference," Wells continued, "is in the scope systems and the precision requirements. These weapons are designed for engagements at ranges that exceed normal infantry capabilities." As Wells explained the equipment, Elena began to notice something troubling. He was describing tactical applications and operational scenarios that went far beyond what should have been included in training exercises. The specific ranges, engagement protocols, and target identification procedures he mentioned were identical to classified special operations procedures that Elena recognized from her own background. "How did you learn about these systems?" Elena asked, playing the role of a curious civilian while actually probing the source of Wells's knowledge. "Cross-training with special operations units," Wells replied casually. "The Army encourages instructors to stay current with advanced tactical developments. It helps us prepare our soldiers for the realities of modern combat." It was a plausible explanation, but Elena knew that legitimate cross-training wouldn't include the level of detail Wells was demonstrating. He was either accessing classified information without proper authorization, or he was deliberately sharing restricted procedures with unauthorized personnel. As the day progressed, Elena observed Wells working with the special operations candidates, and what she saw confirmed her worst suspicions. Wells was teaching tactical procedures that were identical to classified special operations protocols, including specific techniques for target acquisition, range estimation, and engagement sequences that she knew were restricted to the highest levels of military training. Even more concerning, Wells was teaching these procedures as if they were standard training protocols, with no acknowledgement that the information was classified or that the candidates weren't authorized to receive it. Elena began documenting everything she observed, using her maintenance logbook to record detailed notes about the unauthorized procedures and the personnel involved in teaching them. She needed evidence that would prove the systematic nature of the security breaches and identify everyone responsible for the leaks, but her investigation took an unexpected turn when Master Sergeant Reed appeared at the training area. Reed had been observing the advanced training exercises from a distance, but now he approached Wells's station with the kind of focused attention that suggested he was evaluating more than just training effectiveness. Interesting modifications to the standard curriculum, Reed commented, watching as Wells demonstrated scope adjustment procedures to a group of candidates. Just trying to keep current with tactical developments, Wells replied, but Elena noticed a slight tension in his voice that hadn't been there before. Reed nodded thoughtfully, then turned his attention to Elena. "Ms. Frost, how are you finding the advanced equipment? More complex than the basic systems?" "Definitely," Elena replied, though she was careful to monitor Reed's expression for any signs that he was testing her reactions. "It's fascinating to see how sophisticated military training has become." "Indeed," Reed said, but his tone carried an undercurrent that made Elena wonder if he was starting to notice the same irregularities she'd been documenting. As the weekend training continued, Elena began to suspect that Reed was conducting his own investigation into the training procedures being used at Fort Benning. His questions were too specific, his observations too focused for casual interest in curriculum development. The possibility that Reed was also investigating the security breaches created both opportunities and dangers for Elena's mission. If Reed was working to identify unauthorized disclosure of classified information, he might be a valuable ally. But if he discovered Elena's true identity and purpose, he could also compromise her investigation before she'd gathered sufficient evidence to identify all the personnel involved in the leaks. Elena realized she was walking an increasingly dangerous line between gathering the intelligence she needed and maintaining the cover that kept her investigation secret. Wells was clearly at the center of the unauthorized training modifications, but she still needed to determine whether he was acting alone or as part of a larger conspiracy. The answer to that question would determine whether Elena could complete her mission successfully or whether the security breaches at Fort Benning were too extensive and well protected for a single operative to uncover. As Saturday's training concluded and Elena prepared for another day of advanced tactical exercises, she knew that the next 24 hours would be critical. She needed to take bigger risks to gather the evidence she required, but those same risks could expose her identity and compromise everything she'd worked to achieve. The investigation was approaching its most dangerous phase, and Elena wasn't sure she was prepared for what she might discover. Sunday morning brought the kind of crisp autumn weather that made outdoor training at Fort Benning particularly challenging. Elena arrived early to find the special operations candidates already preparing for what Major Shaw had described as the most demanding exercise of the weekend. The atmosphere was tense with anticipation, and the kind of focused energy that came from knowing careers might be decided by the next few hours of performance. Elena was assigned to work directly with the weapon systems that would be used for the final evaluation, which meant she'd have unprecedented access to observe the advanced tactical procedures being taught. But it also meant she'd be working under the direct supervision of both Wells and Reed, who seemed to be paying increasingly close attention to her performance. "Ms. Frost," Reed said as she began her equipment checks, "Major Shaw has requested that all support personnel demonstrate familiarity with the weapon systems they'll be maintaining. He wants to ensure that everyone understands proper handling procedures for the advanced equipment." Elena felt her pulse quicken. A formal demonstration in front of Major Shaw would require her to handle precision weapon systems while senior officers evaluated her performance. Any mistake showing too much expertise or too little competence could compromise her mission. "I'm not sure I'm qualified for that level of demonstration," Elena said, adjusting her glasses nervously. "My experience is still pretty limited." "That's why we're doing it," Reed replied. "Better to identify any knowledge gaps now than during a critical moment in the exercise." Elena realized she had no choice but to participate, though she began calculating how to handle weapons with enough competence to appear trainable. While avoiding any displays of advanced tactical knowledge, Major Shaw was a career special operations officer with the kind of analytical intensity that came from years of evaluating soldiers under extreme conditions. When Elena was introduced to him as part of the support staff, his handshake was firm and his assessment immediate and thorough. "Miss Frost," Shaw said, "Sergeant Reed tells me you've been learning weapons procedures quickly. That's exactly the kind of adaptability we value in support personnel." "Thank you, sir," Elena replied. "Though I should mention that I still feel pretty inexperienced with the more advanced systems." Shaw gestured toward the precision rifle that would be used for the final marksmanship evaluation. "Let's see how you handle this system. Basic safety procedures first, then we'll assess your familiarity with the operational characteristics." Elena approached the rifle with appropriate caution, but she was acutely aware that every movement was being evaluated by multiple experienced officers. She began with the standard safety checks, deliberately moving more slowly than her training demanded to appear genuinely careful rather than automatically competent. "Good," Shaw commented as she completed the unloading procedures. "Now show me how you'd prepare this weapon for cleaning." This was where Elena's careful preparation became critical. She'd spent hours the previous evening reviewing civilian firearms manuals to ensure she could demonstrate basic procedures without revealing her advanced training. She began field stripping the rifle with the kind of hesitant concentration that suggested she was carefully remembering recently learned procedures. But as she worked with the weapon, Elena began to notice something that changed everything about her. Investigation. The precision rifle she was handling had been modified with components that weren't supposed to exist in training weapons. The scope mounting system included classified targeting technology that Elena recognized from special operations equipment. The trigger mechanism had been upgraded with precision components that were restricted to the most advanced military applications. More troubling, the modifications were so sophisticated that they couldn't have been made by individual instructors working alone. Someone with access to classified military technology and significant resources was systematically upgrading Fort Benning's training equipment with restricted components. Elena continued her demonstration while her mind raced through the implications. The security breach she'd been sent to investigate wasn't just about leaked training procedures. Someone was providing access to classified military technology and using Fort Benning as a testing ground for unauthorized equipment modifications. "Interesting," Major Shaw commented as Elena completed the field stripping procedures. "You seem to have a natural aptitude for this kind of work. Have you considered pursuing more advanced training?" Elena looked up from the rifle components with what she hoped was appropriate surprise. "I'm not sure I'd be qualified for anything more advanced. This is already pretty overwhelming." "Don't sell yourself short," Shaw replied. "Good support personnel are invaluable to special operations training. We might have opportunities for someone with your apparent capabilities." Reed was watching the exchange with increased intensity, and Elena got the impression that Shaw's offer was part of some kind of test. She needed to decline the advancement opportunity without appearing suspicious about her reluctance to get more involved with special operations training. "That's very generous," Elena said, "but I'm still learning the basics. I think I need more experience before considering anything more challenging." Shaw nodded, but Elena noticed him exchange a meaningful glance with Reed. Something about her performance had apparently confirmed suspicions they'd been developing about her capabilities. As the weapons demonstration concluded and the candidates began their final tactical exercises, Elena found herself assigned to observe the advanced training procedures from a position that provided perfect oversight of the entire operation. It was the kind of access that should have been invaluable for her investigation, but she was beginning to suspect that her assignment wasn't coincidental. Wells was conducting the final marksmanship evaluation using procedures that Elena now realized incorporated classified targeting protocols. The candidates were being taught engagement techniques that exceeded the scope of any legitimate training program and involved technology that shouldn't have been available at Fort Benning. But as Elena documented the unauthorized procedures, she became aware that Reed was positioned where he could observe her reactions to the training. Every time Wells demonstrated a classified technique, every time a candidate used restricted protocols, Reed seemed to be watching Elena's response. Elena began to suspect that Reed knew more about her true identity than she'd realized. His questions about her background, his attention to her weapons handling, his positioning during critical observations, everything suggested that he'd been conducting his own investigation into her activities, the possibility that Reed had identified her as an undercover operative created immediate dangers for Elena's mission. If Reed was working to protect the security breaches she'd been sent to investigate, her life could be in immediate danger. But if Reed was conducting his own investigation into the unauthorized activities, he might be a potential ally. Elena needed to determine Reed's intentions before the training exercise concluded, and she lost access to the evidence she'd been gathering. But any attempt to probe Reed's knowledge would risk confirming his suspicions about her true identity. As the tactical exercises reached their climax, and the candidates demonstrated their proficiency with the advanced procedures they'd learned, Elena realized that her investigation had reached a critical juncture. She'd identified systematic security breaches that involved multiple personnel and classified technology, but she still needed to determine the full scope of the conspiracy and the identities of everyone involved. More importantly, she needed to complete her mission before Reed or anyone else decided that Elena Frost represented a threat to whatever operation was really taking place at Fort Benning. The next few hours would determine whether Elena's investigation succeeded in exposing a dangerous security breach, or whether she became another casualty of the very conspiracy she'd been sent to uncover. As the final exercise concluded, and the candidates began cleaning their equipment, Major Shaw approached Elena. "One more time, Ms. Frost," he said. "I'd like to speak with you privately about some opportunities that might interest you. Would you be available for a discussion after we complete the post-exercise debriefing?" Elena agreed, though privately she wondered if Shaw's discussion would involve questions about her real identity and purpose at Fort Benning. The investigation was approaching its most dangerous phase, and Elena wasn't sure she was prepared for the confrontation that seemed increasingly inevitable. The post-exercise debriefing took place in a secure conference room within the training complex's administrative building. Elena found herself seated among senior officers and training personnel, ostensibly there as part of the support staff, but actually gathering intelligence about how the unauthorized procedures would be documented and distributed. Major Shaw conducted the debriefing with military precision, reviewing each phase of the weekend's exercises and evaluating candidate performance. But Elena noticed that his assessment focused heavily on the advanced techniques that shouldn't have been part of standard training curricula. "The precision marksmanship demonstrations exceeded expectations," Shaw announced to the assembled group. Candidates showed exceptional proficiency with advanced targeting protocols and engagement procedures. Elena took careful notes, documenting Shaw's specific references to advanced targeting protocols and other terminology that matched classified special operations procedures. She was building a comprehensive case file that would prove the systematic nature of the security breaches. After the formal debriefing concluded, Shaw approached Elena as promised. But instead of the private discussion she'd expected, he was accompanied by both Reed and Captain Brennan. "Miss Frost," Shaw said, "we'd like to discuss some observations we've made about your performance this weekend." Elena felt her heart rate increase, but she maintained her composed civilian demeanor. "I hope I was helpful. This was definitely more complex than anything I'd worked with before." "Actually, that's what we wanted to discuss," Brennan interjected. "Your adaptability and technical comprehension have been remarkable, almost suspiciously so." The directness of Brennan's statement confirmed Elena's fears that her cover was under serious scrutiny. She needed to respond carefully without either confirming their suspicions or appearing evasive. "I'm not sure I understand," Elena said, adjusting her glasses nervously. "I've been trying to learn quickly because I don't want to let anyone down." Reed stepped forward, his expression serious but not hostile. "Ms. Frost, I think it's time we had an honest conversation about who you really are and why you're here." Elena's mind raced through her options. She could continue maintaining her cover story, but it was clear that Reed had developed significant suspicions about her identity. She could attempt to deflect or evade, but that would only confirm their concerns. Or she could take the calculated risk of revealing enough truth to satisfy their questions without compromising her mission. "I'm not sure what you mean," Elena sighed, though her tone carried less conviction than before. Shaw pulled out a folder that Elena hadn't seen before. "We've been conducting our own background investigation into civilian contractors who've had access to sensitive training procedures. Your employment history has some interesting gaps." Elena realized that they'd been investigating her background in parallel with her own investigation of their activities. The question was how much they'd discovered and whether they represented a threat to her mission or potential allies. "What kind of gaps?" Elena asked, deciding that appearing confused was safer than attempting to deflect their questions. "The kind that suggests someone with significant military experience who's working very hard to conceal that background," Reed replied. "The kind that make experienced special operations personnel wonder why someone with advanced tactical knowledge is pretending to be an inexperienced civilian contractor." Elena was silent for a long moment, weighing her options. If Reed, Shaw, and Brennan were part of the conspiracy she'd been sent to investigate, revealing her true identity could be fatal. But if they were conducting their own investigation into the security breaches, they might be valuable allies. "Before we continue this conversation," Elena said carefully, "I need to understand something. Are you questioning my background because you're concerned about security breaches in the training programs?" The question was a calculated probe designed to determine whether they were investigating the same problems she'd been sent to uncover. Shaw and Reed exchanged glances before Shaw responded. "We've noticed irregularities in training procedures and equipment that suggest unauthorized access to classified materials. Your presence here, combined with your apparent expertise, has raised questions about whether you're connected to those irregularities." Elena felt a surge of relief. Their investigation was focused on the same security breaches she'd been sent to identify, which suggested they might be allies rather than threats. "I think we need to have that honest conversation," Elena said finally, "but not here. Too many people have access to this facility." Reed nodded. "There's a secure office in the intelligence building. We can continue this discussion there." As they prepared to leave the conference room, Elena caught sight of Sergeant First Class Wells watching their group with obvious concern. His expression suggested that he'd noticed the intensity of their conversation and was worried about what might be discussed. The observation confirmed Elena's suspicions that Wells was central to the security breaches. His concern about her conversations with senior officers suggested that he had something to hide and was worried about exposure. The secure office in the intelligence building was equipped with the kind of electronic countermeasures that would prevent surveillance or recording of their conversation. Shaw activated the security protocols before turning his attention back to Elena. "Now then," Shaw said, "let's start with your real name and actual background." Elena took a deep breath, knowing that the next few minutes would determine whether her mission succeeded or failed completely. "My name is Elena Vasquez," she said, using a partial cover identity that would satisfy their questions without revealing her complete operational background. "I'm a federal investigator working for the Department of Defense Inspector General's office. I've been sent here to investigate reports of unauthorized disclosure of classified training materials. The revelation seemed to satisfy some of their concerns while raising new questions about her specific mission and authority. What kind of unauthorized disclosure? Brennan asked. Classified special operations procedures being incorporated into regular training curricula without proper authorization. Elena replied. Advanced tactical techniques being taught to personnel who aren't cleared for that level of information. Reed leaned forward with increased interest. We've noticed the same problems. Instructors using procedures that exceed their authorization. Equipment modifications that include classified technology. Training scenarios that incorporate restricted tactical protocols. Elena felt a surge of excitement. Not only were Reed, Shaw, and Brennan investigating the same security breaches, but they'd apparently identified the same patterns of unauthorized activity that had triggered her assignment. How long have you been observing these irregularities? Elena asked. Several months, Shaw replied. But we haven't been able to identify the source of the classified information or determine how many personnel are involved. Elena pulled out her maintenance logbook, which actually contained detailed intelligence assessments of everything she'd observed since arriving at Fort Benning. I've been documenting systematic security breaches involving multiple instructors and unauthorized equipment modifications, she said, showing them her carefully coded notes. The scope of the problem appears to be much larger than anyone realized. As Elena shared her findings with Reed, Shaw, and Brennan, a picture emerged of a conspiracy that involved not just leaked training procedures, but systematic theft and distribution of classified military technology. Someone at Fort Benning was conducting unauthorized experiments with advanced military systems, using the training facility as a testing ground for procedures and equipment that exceeded the scope of legitimate military training. The question was whether they could identify everyone involved in the conspiracy before the perpetrators realized they were under investigation and either destroyed evidence or eliminated witnesses. Elena's mission had become significantly more complex, but she'd also gained valuable allies who could help her uncover the full scope of the security breach and bring the responsible parties to justice. The secure conference room fell silent as Elena spread out her documentation across the table. 3 weeks of careful observation had produced a comprehensive intelligence picture that shocked even the experienced officers who'd been conducting their own investigation. The security breach is more extensive than we initially suspected, Elena began, pointing to her coded notes and surveillance observations. Someone has been systematically extracting classified special operations procedures and using Fort Benning as a testing ground for unauthorized tactical innovations. Shaw studied Elena's documentation with growing concern. These equipment modifications you've identified, some of this technology shouldn't exist outside of classified research programs. That's exactly what troubled me, Elena replied. The precision rifle I examined yesterday included targeting systems that are restricted to the most advanced special operations units. Someone with very high-level access has been providing classified military technology for use in supposedly standard training exercises. Reed pointed to Elena's notes about Sergeant First Class Wells. You've identified Wells as a central figure in the unauthorized training modifications. What's your assessment of his role in the larger conspiracy? Elena had been dreading this question because her investigation had revealed information that would be difficult for Wells's colleagues to accept. Wells isn't just incorporating unauthorized procedures into his training, Elena said carefully. Based on my observations, he's been systematically photographing and documenting classified tactical procedures, then transmitting that information to outside contacts. The accusation created a heavy silence in the room. Wells was a respected instructor with an exemplary service record, and suggesting that he was engaged in espionage was a serious charge that would require overwhelming evidence. That's a significant allegation, Brennan said quietly. Ian Wells has been with us for 2 years. His background checks were clean, His performance evaluations have been outstanding. Elena understood their reluctance to believe that a trusted colleague could be involved in espionage, but her evidence was compelling. I've documented 17 instances where Wells has taught procedures that match classified special operations protocols, Elena explained. But more concerning, I've observed him using personal devices to record training sessions and document equipment specifications that should be restricted. She pulled out a series of photographs she'd taken during training exercises, showing Wells using his personal phone to record demonstrations and take detailed pictures of weapon systems. Standard protocol prohibits personal devices during training with classified equipment, Reed observed. If Wells has been recording these sessions, then he's been creating a comprehensive library of classified tactical procedures and restricted military technology, Elena finished. The question is what he's doing with that information. Shaw leaned back in his chair, processing the implications. Do we have any evidence of who Wells might be working with or how he's transmitting the information? Elena nodded grimly. That's where the investigation gets really concerning. Wells isn't working alone. She spread out additional documentation that showed patterns of communication and coordination between multiple personnel at Fort Benning. Staff Sergeant Bishop has been modifying training equipment with unauthorized components, Elena continued. The precision rifles, advanced targeting systems, even some of the training scenarios, they've all been enhanced with technology that exceeds the scope of legitimate training requirements. Bishop too? Brennan asked, her voice reflecting the key shock of discovering that multiple trusted personnel were involved in the conspiracy. Bishop appears to be responsible for the technical aspects of the operation, Elena explained. While Wells documents the procedures and training methods, Bishop modifies equipment and incorporates classified technology into the training systems. Reed studied Elena's evidence with the analytical focus of someone who'd spent years evaluating intelligence information. This suggests a sophisticated operation with specific objectives, he said. They're not just stealing information randomly. They're systematically extracting specific types of tactical knowledge and military technology. Elena had reached the same conclusion. The pattern suggests they're fulfilling specific intelligence requirements from an outside source. Someone is directing them to obtain particular types of information. Shaw's expression had grown increasingly grim as he reviewed Elena's documentation. If Wells and Bishop are working together to extract classified information, then we're dealing with an active espionage operation on a military installation. There's more, Elena said, though she was reluctant to reveal the full scope of what she'd discovered. My investigation suggests that the operation extends beyond Fort Benning. She pulled out intelligence reports that had been provided as part of her briefing materials. Similar security breaches have been reported at training facilities in 3 other states, Elena explained. Unauthorized modification of training procedures, equipment upgrades that include classified technology, instructors teaching advanced tactics without proper authorization. The revelation that Fort Benning was part of a multi-state espionage operation raised the stakes significantly. Do we know who's coordinating these operations? Reed asked. Elena hesitated before answering, because her briefing materials had included information that implicated personnel at very high levels of the military command structure. Intelligence analysis suggests that the operations are being coordinated by someone with access to classified research programs and the authority to direct training modifications at multiple installations, she said carefully. Shaw understood the implications immediately. You're suggesting that someone in the Pentagon or Special Operations Command is directing this espionage operation. I'm suggesting that the scope and sophistication of the operation requires resources and authority that exceed what individual instructors could access independently. Elena replied diplomatically. The conference room fell silent as the 3 officers processed the full implications of Elena's investigation. They were dealing with not just isolated security breaches, but a systematic espionage operation that involved multiple installations and potentially high-ranking military personnel. "What's our next step?" Brennan asked. Elena had been planning this phase of the operation since before she'd arrived at Fort Benning. "We need to gather direct evidence of Wells and Bishop transmitting classified information to outside contacts," she said. "My observations have documented their unauthorized activities, but we need proof of actual espionage before we can make arrests." Reed nodded. "That means surveillance of their communications and documentation of their contacts with outside parties." "Exactly," Elena agreed. "But we need to be careful. If Wells and Bishop realize they're under investigation, they could destroy evidence or alert their handlers that the operation has been compromised." Shaw stood and began pacing, a sign that he was developing an operational plan. "We need to coordinate with military intelligence and the FBI," he said. "This operation is too large and too sensitive for us to handle alone." Elena had been expecting this decision, but she also knew that expanding the investigation would create new risks. "I agree that we need additional resources," she said, "but we also need to be careful about operational security. If there are high-ranking personnel involved in this conspiracy, expanding the circle of knowledge could alert them that their operation has been exposed." Reed understood the dilemma. "We need help, but we don't know who we can trust." Elena pulled out a secure communication device that she'd kept hidden throughout her assignment. "I have direct contact with my supervisors at the Inspector General's office," she said. "They can coordinate with appropriate federal agencies while maintaining operational security." As Elena activated the secure communication system and began coordinating with her headquarters, Reed, Shaw, and Brennan prepared to implement the next phase of their investigation. They'd identified the key personnel involved in the espionage operation, but now they needed to gather evidence that would prove actual transmission of classified information to foreign contacts. It would be the most dangerous phase of the investigation, because Wells and Bishop would be on highest alert for any signs that their activities were being monitored. Elena's mission was entering its final stage, and the next few days would determine whether they successfully exposed a major espionage operation or whether the conspirators escaped to continue their activities at other military installations. The surveillance operation began at 0400 hours on Tuesday morning, with Elena and her new allies positioned to monitor Wells and Bishop's activities without alerting them to the investigation. Federal agents had arrived during the night, establishing electronic surveillance of communications and preparing to document any evidence of classified information being transmitted to unauthorized contacts. Elena maintained her cover as a civilian contractor, arriving for work at her normal time and conducting routine maintenance activities while actually serving as the primary observer for the surveillance operation. Her position gave her legitimate access to the training areas where Wells and Bishop would be working, allowing her to monitor their activities without arousing suspicion. The breakthrough came sooner than anyone expected. At 0930 hours, Elena observed Wells conducting what appeared to be a routine equipment inspection in the weapons storage facility. But through her concealed surveillance equipment, she could see that he was actually photographing serial numbers and technical specifications of classified weapons systems. More damning, Wells was using a specialized camera that Elena recognized as equipment designed for intelligence collection. This wasn't casual photography, it was systematic documentation of military technology using professional espionage tools. Elena activated her secure communication system to alert the surveillance team. Target 1 is conducting intelligence collection and building 4A equipment. Suggests professional training and external support. The response came immediately from Agent Sarah Mitchell, the FBI counterintelligence specialist who was coordinating the federal investigation. "Copy that. Continue observation and document all activities." 20 minutes later, Elena watched Wells exit the storage facility and walk directly to Staff Sergeant Bishop's maintenance workshop. The two men engaged in what appeared to be casual conversation, but Elena's enhanced surveillance equipment revealed that Wells was transferring digital storage devices to Bishop. Target 1 has made contact with Target 2, Elena reported. Digital media transfer confirmed. The evidence was exactly what they needed to prove coordination between Wells and Bishop in the systematic theft of classified information. But the surveillance operation was about to take a dangerous turn. As Elena continued her observation from a concealed position, she noticed a third individual approaching the maintenance workshop. Captain Brennan was walking toward Bishop's location. With the kind of purposeful stride that suggested an important meeting, Elena felt a chill of concern. Brennan was supposed to be coordinating with the surveillance team, not meeting with the suspects they were investigating. "Command, I have an unexpected development," Elena reported through her secure communication system. Target 3 has arrived at the meeting location. The response from Agent Mitchell carried urgency that confirmed Elena's concerns. Target 3 was not expected. Maintain observation and be prepared for immediate extraction if necessary. Elena watched through her surveillance equipment as Brennan entered Bishop's workshop and immediately began what appeared to be an intense conversation with Wells and Bishop. The body language of all three individuals suggested anxiety and concern that went beyond routine training discussions. After 10 minutes of animated conversation, Elena observed Brennan hand a manila envelope to Wells. The transfer was brief and discreet, but Elena's enhanced surveillance equipment captured clear images of the exchange. "Command, Target 3 has provided materials to Target 1, Elena reported. "This appears to be a coordinated handoff of sensitive information." Elena's worst fears were being confirmed. Captain Brennan wasn't just aware of the espionage operation, she was actively participating in it. The officer who had been working with Elena to investigate the security breaches was actually one of the conspirators responsible for them. The realization created immediate danger for Elena's safety. If Brennan was part of the espionage operation, then she knew about Elena's true identity and mission. Elena could be walking into a trap designed to eliminate a federal investigator who had gotten too close to exposing the conspiracy. Elena's secure communication device activated with an urgent message from Agent Mitchell. "You may be compromised. Prepare for immediate extraction. Do not return to your normal duties." But Elena's response surprised the federal surveillance team. "Negative on extraction. I need to maintain cover long enough to document the full scope of their operation. They don't know I've identified Brennan as a conspirator." Elena had made a calculated decision to continue her surveillance despite the increased personal risk. The evidence they'd gathered was strong, but she needed to document Brennan's role in the operation to prevent her from escaping prosecution or alerting other conspirators. As Elena maintained her observation, she watched Brennan, Wells, and Bishop conclude their meeting and begin moving toward different areas of the base. Their separation suggested they were implementing some kind of contingency plan, possibly in response to concerns that their operation might be under investigation. Elena made the dangerous decision to follow Brennan while the federal agents continued surveillance of Wells and Bishop. She needed to understand Brennan's role in the conspiracy and determine whether there were additional conspirators who hadn't been identified. Brennan's destination was the base communication center, where she had authorized access to classified communication systems. Elena couldn't follow her inside the secure facility, but she positioned herself where she could observe Brennan's activities through the facility's windows. What Elena saw through her surveillance equipment confirmed her worst suspicions. Brennan was using classified communication systems to transmit information to unauthorized recipients. The equipment displays that Elena could observe showed data transfers that appeared to involve the photographs and technical specifications that Wells had collected earlier. Elena documented everything she observed, building a comprehensive case file that would prove Brennan's leadership role in the espionage operation. But her surveillance activities were about to be discovered in the most dangerous way possible. As Elena adjusted her position to get better observation of the communications facility, she became aware that someone was approaching her location from behind. She turned carefully, expecting to see a routine patrol or maintenance worker. Instead, she found herself facing Master Sergeant Reed, but his expression was different from anything she'd seen before. The analytical intensity was gone, replaced by something that looked like disappointment and determination. "Agent Vasquez," Reed said quietly, using the cover name Elena had provided during their secure meeting. "I think it's time we had another honest conversation." Elena realized that Reed's approach wasn't coincidental. He'd been tracking her movements and had deliberately confronted her at a moment when she was isolated and vulnerable. "Sergeant Reed," Elena replied, keeping her voice steady despite the adrenaline surge that came from being discovered during covert surveillance. "I'm conducting authorized observation of base personnel as part of our investigation." Reed's expression remained serious. "I know exactly what you're doing. The question is whether you understand what you've gotten yourself into." Elena's hand moved toward the emergency signal device that would summon immediate federal backup, but Reed noticed the movement immediately. "I wouldn't recommend that," Reed said. "You're going to want to hear what I have to say before you decide whether to call for backup." Elena realized that Reed's confrontation could mean either her immediate arrest by a conspirator who discovered her investigation, or the revelation of information that would change everything about her understanding of the operation she'd been sent to uncover. The next few minutes would determine whether Elena's mission succeeded in exposing a major espionage operation, or whether she became another casualty of a conspiracy that extended far deeper into the military command structure than anyone had realized. Reed's words hung in the air between them like a challenge, and Elena found herself calculating distances to cover, escape routes, and the likelihood that federal backup could reach her before Reed could neutralize her as a threat to whatever operation he represented. "I'm listening," Elena said carefully, keeping her hands visible but ready to move if necessary. Reed glanced around to ensure they weren't being observed, then pulled out an identification wallet that Elena hadn't seen before. The credentials inside identified him as Special Agent Caleb Reed, Defense Intelligence Agency. "I've been undercover at Fort Benning for 8 months, Reed said, investigating the same espionage operation that brought you here. But there's information about this case that wasn't included in your briefing." Elena felt a mixture of relief and confusion. Reed was an ally, not a threat, but his revelation raised immediate questions about why 2 separate agencies were conducting parallel investigations of the same operation. "Why wasn't I informed that DIA had an operative in place?" Elena asked. "Because the espionage operation we're investigating extends into the intelligence community itself," Reed replied grimly. "We have reason to believe that someone with access to federal investigative operations has been providing advance warning to the espionage network." The implication was staggering. If someone within the federal intelligence community was protecting the espionage operation, then Elena's investigation could have been compromised from the beginning. "Are you suggesting that my mission was known to the conspirators?" Elena asked. Reed nodded. "Your arrival at Fort Benning was anticipated. Brennan, Wells, and Bishop have been conducting enhanced operational security for the past month, specifically because they were warned that a federal investigator might be inserted into their operation." Elena realized that her careful surveillance had been successful not because of her operational skills, but because the conspirators had allowed her to observe their activities. They'd been feeding her information to determine the scope of the federal investigation and identify everyone involved in it. "Then everything I've documented, double quotes," Elena began, "is real," Reed confirmed, "but it's also incomplete. The operation you've been observing is a small part of a much larger espionage network that includes personnel at multiple military installations and several federal agencies. Reed activated a secure communication device similar to Elena's, but with additional encryption capabilities that suggested direct connection to the highest levels of military intelligence. Agent Mitchell, Reed said into the device. This is Special Agent Reed. I'm with Agent Vasquez, and we need to implement containment protocol immediately. Elena heard Agent Mitchell's response through Reed's communication system. Understood. Federal backup is in position, and we have electronic surveillance of all primary targets. Are you ready to proceed with arrests? Reed looked at Elena before responding. Agent Vasquez needs to understand the full scope of the operation before we make arrests. There are aspects of this case that affect her personal safety. Elena felt a chill of concern. What kind of personal safety issues? Reed's expression became even more serious. The espionage network has been systematically eliminating federal investigators who get too close to exposing their operation. 3 agents have died in the past 18 months in what appeared to be accidents or training incidents. The revelation that Elena's investigation had put her life in immediate danger explained why Reed had approached her in an isolated location. He wasn't just providing operational updates, he was implementing protective measures. Captain Brennan isn't just participating in the espionage operation, Reed continued. She's responsible for identifying federal investigators and coordinating their elimination. Your cover identity has been compromised since the day you arrived here. Elena realized that her entire mission had been conducted under threat of assassination, and that Brennan's apparent cooperation with the investigation had actually been designed to gather intelligence about federal operations. Why didn't you contact me sooner? Elena asked. Because we needed to identify everyone in the network before making arrests, Reed replied. Your investigation provided the final pieces of evidence we needed to prove the conspiracy extends to federal personnel. Reed activated his communication device again. Agent Mitchell, we're ready to proceed with simultaneous arrests. Target list includes Brennan, Wells, Bishop, and the federal contact who's been providing operational intelligence to the network. Elena heard multiple federal agents acknowledging the arrest orders, and within minutes the secure area around them was filled with FBI and military police vehicles moving to apprehend the conspirators. Through her surveillance equipment, Elena watched as Brennan was arrested at the communications center while attempting to transmit warning messages to other members of the espionage network. Wells and Bishop were taken into custody at their respective locations, along with extensive evidence of their intelligence collection activities. But the most significant arrest took place at the federal building in Atlanta, where Elena's original contact from the Inspector General's office was apprehended while attempting to destroy evidence of his collaboration with the espionage network. Deputy Inspector General Marcus Fleming has been providing advance warning of federal investigations to the espionage network for over 2 years, Reed explained as they watched the arrests unfold. Your mission was compromised before it began, because Fleming informed the network that you were being sent to Fort Benning. Elena felt a surge of anger at the betrayal by someone she'd trusted with her life, but also relief that the conspiracy had finally been exposed and the perpetrators were being held accountable. What happens now? Elena asked. Reed pointed toward the federal agents who were securing evidence and processing the arrests. Extensive investigation to identify the full scope of the network, prosecution of everyone involved, and comprehensive security review to prevent similar breaches in the future. As the immediate danger passed and Elena's mission officially concluded, she found herself thinking about the broader implications of what they'd uncovered. The espionage operation had succeeded for years because it included personnel at the highest levels of military and federal agencies, people who were supposed to protect national security but had instead betrayed it for personal gain. Agent Vasquez. Agent Mitchell said as she approached Elena and Reed, "Your investigation provided crucial evidence that allowed us to expose this network. The intelligence you gathered during the past 3 weeks will be essential for prosecuting everyone involved." Elena nodded, though she felt emotionally drained by the revelation that her entire mission had been conducted under threat of assassination. "I'm glad we were able to stop them before they could steal additional classified information or eliminate other investigators." Reed's expression reflected similar exhaustion mixed with satisfaction at the successful conclusion of his 8-month undercover operation. "The most important thing is that we prevented the network from expanding to additional military installations. They were planning to implement similar operations at bases throughout the country." As federal agents continued securing evidence and processing arrests, Elena began completing the documentation that would support the prosecution of the espionage network. Her maintenance logbook, which had served as cover for detailed intelligence assessments, would become a crucial piece of evidence in the trials that would follow. The investigation that had begun with Elena learning to clean her first rifle at Fort Benning had ultimately exposed one of the most sophisticated espionage operations in recent military history. But more importantly, it had prevented the continued theft of classified military technology and the assassination of additional federal investigators. Elena's mission was complete, but the impact of her investigation would continue for years. As prosecutors worked to hold the conspirators accountable in security, agencies implemented reforms to prevent similar betrayals in the future. 6 months after the arrests at Fort Benning, Elena found herself in a federal courthouse in Atlanta, watching as the final defendants in the espionage case received their sentences. The legal proceedings had been complex and lengthy, involving multiple federal agencies and requiring careful handling of classified evidence. But the outcomes had vindicated her investigation. Captain Holly Brennan, who had orchestrated the espionage operation from her position within the training command, received a sentence of 25 years in federal prison for conspiracy, espionage, and the attempted murder of federal investigators. The evidence Elena had gathered during her surveillance had been crucial in proving Brennan's leadership role in the conspiracy. Sergeant First Class Ian Wells and Staff Sergeant Craig Bishop each received 15-year sentences for their roles in stealing and transmitting classified military technology. The technical evidence they had systematically collected over 2 years had been sold to foreign intelligence services and private military contractors, compromising American tactical advantages in multiple operational theaters. But the most significant sentence was imposed on Deputy Inspector General Marcus Fleming, who received life imprisonment for his betrayal of federal investigators and his role in coordinating the deaths of 3 agents who had gotten too close to exposing the network. Elena's testimony about how Fleming had compromised her mission had been particularly damaging to his defense. As Elena left the courthouse after the final sentencing, she was approached by Special Agent Reed, who had transitioned from his undercover role to a position with the Defense Intelligence Agency's Counterintelligence Division. "How does it feel to see justice served?" Reed asked as they walked toward the parking area. Elena considered the question carefully. The successful prosecution of the espionage network had provided closure for her investigation, but it had also revealed troubling vulnerabilities in military and federal security systems. "Satisfying but sobering," Elena replied. "The fact that this operation succeeded for over 2 years shows how vulnerable our institutions are to insider threats." Reed nodded. "That's why the reforms that came out of your investigation are so important. The new security protocols and oversight procedures should prevent similar networks from operating undetected." Elena had been briefed on the comprehensive security reforms that had been implemented at military training facilities throughout the country. Enhanced background investigations for personnel with access to classified materials, improved oversight of training curriculum modifications, and regular counterintelligence assessments were now standard procedures at installations like Fort Benning. Any regrets about how the operation unfolded? Reed asked. Elena thought about the 3 weeks she'd spent at Fort Benning, maintaining her cover as a civilian contractor, while conducting one of the most dangerous investigations of her career. I wish we could have prevented the security breaches. That occurred before we identified the network, she said. The classified information that was stolen during those 2 years caused real damage to American military capabilities. Reed understood her concern. The damage assessment conducted after the arrests had revealed that the espionage network had compromised tactical procedures used by special operations units in active combat zones. American soldiers had faced increased dangers because their enemies had access to classified tactical information. But without your investigation, the network would still be operating, Reed pointed out. The intelligence they were stealing would have continued compromising American operations indefinitely. As they reached Elena's car, Reed handed her an envelope that contained her new assignment orders. The Inspector General's office has requested that you lead a new counterintelligence unit focused on investigating insider threats at military installations, Reed said. Your experience at Fort Benning has made you the subject matter expert on how these networks operate. Elena examined the assignment orders with mixed feelings. The new position would allow her to apply the lessons learned from her investigation to protect other military facilities from similar security breaches. But it would also mean continued exposure to the kind of dangerous undercover operations that had nearly cost her life. It's an important mission, Elena said finally. And after what we uncovered at Fort Benning, I think it's necessary work. Reed smiled. I was hoping you'd see it that way. The military needs investigators who understand both the technical aspects of security breaches and the operational challenges of exposing insider threats. As Elena prepared to leave, she found herself thinking about the soldiers and training personnel at Fort Benning, who had been unaware that their workplace was being used as cover for espionage activities. The young recruits learning basic weapons procedures, the special operations candidates mastering advanced tactical techniques, the dedicated instructors working to prepare soldiers for combat. All of them had been affected by the betrayal of personnel they'd trusted. Do you think this experience will change how military personnel view security threats? Elena asked. Reed considered the question. I think it will make everyone more aware that threats don't always come from outside our institutions. Sometimes, the most dangerous enemies are the ones wearing the same uniform. Elena's phone rang with a call from her new supervisor at the Inspector General's office. Her assignment to the counterintelligence unit would begin the following week, and there were already 3 ongoing investigations that required her expertise. Agent Vasquez, her supervisor said, we have reports of suspicious activity at training facilities in North Carolina and Texas. The patterns are similar to what you uncovered at Fort Benning. Elena felt a familiar surge of determination. The successful investigation at Fort Benning had been just the beginning of a larger effort to protect military institutions from insider threats. I'll review the case files immediately, Elena replied. When do you need me to deploy? As Elena drove away from the courthouse, she thought about the civilian contractor persona she'd maintained during her time at Fort Benning. Elena Frost, the quiet maintenance worker who'd been learning to clean her first rifle, had served her purpose and would never be seen again. But the investigation skills and operational experience that persona had concealed would continue protecting American military personnel from those who would betray their trust. The experience at Fort Benning had taught Elena that the most dangerous threats to national security often came from within the institutions designed to protect it. People who took oaths to defend their country, but chose instead to sell its secrets for personal gain represented a form of betrayal that went beyond simple criminality. But her investigation had also demonstrated that dedicated federal agents and military personnel could work together to expose even the most sophisticated insider threats. The collaboration between Elena's Inspector General investigation and Reed's Defense Intelligence operation had proven that interagency cooperation could overcome the advantages that insider conspirators thought they possessed. As Elena began preparing for her new assignment, she knew that the lessons learned at Fort Benning would guide her approach to future investigations. The quiet woman who'd cleaned rifles and observed training exercises had evolved into one of the federal government's most effective counterintelligence specialists. Elena's mission at Fort Benning was complete, but her work protecting American military personnel from insider threats was just beginning. The skills she'd developed while maintaining her cover as a civilian contractor would serve her well in the dangerous investigations that lay ahead. The espionage network that had operated at Fort Benning had been destroyed, its members imprisoned, and its capabilities neutralized. But Elena knew that other networks were already forming, other insider threats were developing, and other dedicated investigators would be needed to protect the institutions that kept America safe. Her phone buzzed with a text message containing the address of a military facility in North Carolina where suspicious activities had been reported. Elena's next investigation was about to begin, and she felt the familiar mixture of anticipation and determination that came with accepting another dangerous assignment in service of her country. 1 year after her assignment to Fort Benning concluded, Elena stood in another weapons training facility, this time at Fort Liberty in North Carolina. But her role had changed dramatically from the quiet civilian contractor who'd learned to clean her first rifle under Master Sergeant Reed's watchful eye. Now, Elena was conducting a security briefing for training personnel, sharing the lessons learned from her investigation and helping military installations implement the security protocols that had emerged from the Fort Benning case. The most important thing to remember, Elena told the assembled group of instructors and administrators, is that insider threats don't announce themselves. The people who pose the greatest security risks are often the ones who appear most trustworthy and competent. The audience included officers and senior enlisted personnel from multiple military branches, all of whom had been selected to receive advanced training in recognizing and preventing security breaches at their installations. Elena's presentation included case studies from the Fort Benning investigation, carefully edited to protect classified information while illustrating the methods used by insider threats to steal sensitive military technology and procedures. Captain Brennan had an exemplary service record and outstanding performance evaluations. Elena explained, referring to the former training officer who was now serving a 25-year federal prison sentence. Her position gave her authorized access to classified materials, which made her betrayal particularly difficult to detect. One of the attendees, a Navy commander responsible for special operations training, raised his hand. How do we balance necessary security measures with the trust that's essential for military operations? It was a question Elena had been asked repeatedly during her briefings at military installations throughout the country. Security measures should enhance rather than undermine operational effectiveness, Elena replied. The protocols we've developed focus on detecting unusual patterns of behavior and unauthorized access to information, not on restricting legitimate training activities. After the formal briefing concluded, Elena was approached by Colonel James Harrison, the installation commander, who had requested her visit to Fort Liberty. Agent Vasquez, Harrison said, I wanted to personally thank you for the work you did at Fort Benning. The security reforms that came out of your investigation have already prevented similar breaches at other installations. Elena appreciated the recognition, but she was more interested in hearing about the practical implementation of the new security measures. How have your personnel responded to the enhanced security protocols? She asked. Initially, there was some resistance, Harrison admitted. Military personnel are accustomed to high levels of mutual trust, And additional security measures can feel like accusations of disloyalty. But once we explained the Fort Benning case and the real threats posed by insider espionage, the response became much more positive. Elena nodded. Education and communication had been crucial components of implementing security reforms throughout the military. Personnel needed to understand not just what the new procedures required, but why those procedures were necessary. Have you identified any security concerns since implementing the new protocols? Elena asked. Harrison's expression became more serious. Actually, that's one of the reasons I requested your visit. We've observed some irregularities that might indicate an emerging security threat. Elena felt the familiar surge of alertness that came with the possibility of a new investigation. What kind of irregularities? Training procedures that exceed authorized curricula, equipment modifications that include unauthorized components, and communication patterns that suggest coordination between personnel who shouldn't have operational reasons to work together. Harrison explained. The description matched the early indicators that Elena had observed at Fort Benning, suggesting that another espionage network might be developing at Fort Liberty. I'd like to review your observations and assess whether a formal investigation is warranted, Elena said. Harrison led Elena to a secure conference room where he'd assembled documentation of the suspicious activities his security personnel had observed. The patterns were familiar but not identical to the Fort Benning case, suggesting that whoever was behind the potential security breaches had learned from the mistakes that led to the earlier network's exposure. This appears to be a more sophisticated operation than what we encountered at Fort Benning, Elena observed after reviewing the evidence. The perpetrators are using better operational security and more subtle methods of accessing classified information. Harrison nodded grimly. That's our assessment as well. If there is an insider threat developing here, it's being conducted by people who studied the Fort Benning case and modified their methods accordingly. Elena spent the next several hours reviewing security footage, personnel records, and training documentation that Harrison's staff had flagged as potentially suspicious. The evidence was suggestive, but not conclusive, indicating that a formal investigation would be necessary to determine whether actual security breaches were occurring. I recommend that the Inspector General's office authorize a full counterintelligence investigation, Elena told Harrison. The patterns you've identified are consistent with insider threat activities, and early intervention is crucial for preventing the kind of extensive damage we saw at Fort Benning. As Elena prepared to leave Fort Liberty and return to her headquarters to coordinate the new investigation, she found herself thinking about the evolution of her career since that first day when she'd picked up a training rifle under Reed's observation, the quiet civilian contractor who'd been learning basic weapons procedures had become one of the federal government's leading experts on military insider threats. Her experience at Fort Benning had provided unique insights into how espionage networks operated within military institutions and how they could be detected and defeated. But more importantly, Elena's work was helping protect the soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines who depended on classified military technology and procedures to survive in combat situations. Every security breach prevented, every insider threat exposed, every espionage network dismantled meant that American military personnel could operate with confidence that their tactical advantages hadn't been compromised by betrayal. Elena's phone rang with a call from Agent Reed, who had become a close colleague and occasional partner in complex counterintelligence investigations. How did the Fort Liberty briefing go? Reed asked. Educational for everyone involved, Elena replied. But I think we may have identified another emerging threat that's going to require immediate attention. Reed understood the implications. Do you need support for the preliminary investigation? Elena looked back at Fort Liberty's training facilities, where dedicated military personnel were working to prepare soldiers for the dangers of modern combat, unaware that their efforts might again be threatened by insider espionage. "I think this one is going to require the full team," Elena said. "The sophistication of the operation suggests we're dealing with adversaries who learned from our success at Fort Benning and developed countermeasures." As Elena drove away from Fort Liberty, she reflected on how her career had come full circle. She'd begun her investigation at Fort Benning as an undercover operative, pretending to learn basic military procedures. Now she was a recognized expert helping military installations protect themselves from the kind of threats she'd once been sent to uncover. The woman who'd cleaned rifles and collected brass casings had evolved into someone who understood both the vulnerabilities and the strengths of American military institutions. Elena's expertise had been earned through dangerous investigations and close collaboration with dedicated military personnel who shared her commitment to protecting national security. Her next investigation at Fort Liberty would test whether the lessons learned from Fort Benning could be applied to defeating more sophisticated insider threats. But Elena was confident that the same dedication and expertise that had exposed the original espionage network would prove effective against whatever new challenges awaited. The quiet woman who'd once held her first rifle with carefully concealed expertise had become a guardian of the institutions that kept America safe. Elena's journey from undercover operative to counterintelligence specialist reflected her understanding that the most important battles for national security were often fought by people whose names would never be known, whose sacrifices would never be publicly recognized, but whose work made the difference between security and vulnerability. Elena's mission continued, and she was ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.